So the presentation that I have for today is called Attention, Consciousness, and Mental Imagery. But what, in what manner? Because these three topics are always kind of are intertwined, are talking to each other. But somehow we don't know yet the relationship between the three of them. It's very new, I think. I have seen very little literature that discusses the three together. So I'm on Twitter, as many of you know, so please feel free to reach out, DM me there, as well as using my email address if you have any question later on. All right, so what I'm going to do today, I'm going to discuss for the first 20 minutes about a new model of mental imagery. Then I would like to discuss with you the second completely different pathway that I was working on, discussing the relationship between attentional orienting and visual conscious processing. And then I'm going to ask you to piece it together. First, I'm going to ask you to do a little bit of exercise with me, which is what I do a lot when we start presenting this work. The first thing I'm going to ask you to close your eyes and keep them closed. And think about Leonardo da Vinci's Mona Lisa now. Keep your eyes closed and try to come up with this mental image. And then I'm going to ask you to tell me, is she looking at you or not? Keep your eyes closed if you can. And think, is Mona Lisa staring at you or not? And now that you have thought about it, I'm going to ask you to answer an additional question, which is her hair curled or straight? You can think about it, try to come up with Mona Lisa, a mental image, and decide whether one of these two examples, one of these two options is actually happening. Now you can open back your eyes and you can see Mona Lisa's again here on the screen. And you can kind of try to, answer those questions, but when you have in front of you the actual perceptual image, right? And you will see how different subjectively is the feeling of having the item in front of you and being able to inspect it with a HD resolution, and the different feeling that you've just experienced, most likely. Even if you are a super Leonardo da Vinci fan, or Mona Lisa's in particular fan, maybe some of the details were not there in your mental image. I'm going to ask you to do another small exercise, another small, let's say, practice test with me. And I'm going to ask you to do the same thing. So close again your eyes. Let's try it again. So close your eyes and think about Leonardo da Vinci's Mona Lisa. And tell me if she's looking at you or not. Or think about if she's looking at you or not. And then try to, again, pull up the image of the hair and think about if her hair is curled or straight. Why am I asking you to do this exercise? Well, because somehow the literature on mental imagery has been discussing a lot about this subjective experience of pulling up mental images, right? But there is many problems. There have many issues in the way we have studied mental imagery. Mental imagery have been identified in the past. One of them is there is a significant difference between the quality of the image, of a mental image that you can pull up, that you can come up. If you've never seen that image recently, and there's a different quality of the image of Mona Lisa if you've just saw it a few seconds ago, right? Even if I didn't tell you, hey, I'm going to ask you to rethink about Mona Lisa again. So I didn't instruct you, keep it in your working memory, right? But still, the second time around that you think about Mona Lisa, you have a clearer definition of that image. This is an issue that in mental imagery has been daunting these studies that have used event-related kind of presentation of stimuli, because if I tell you, think about an apple, and you tell me, okay, I thought about it, and you tell me, okay, how vivid was that image? And you tell me it was vivid 3, okay, then we go back to the next trial, and I show you a visual apple. That visual apple will significantly affect the way you will respond to any other trial in the experiment. So we have to be very careful about how to study mental imagery, and having somehow a mental imagery study that is not affected by the previous presentation of visual objects. So somehow, in my experience, I don't know with you, in my experience, mental imagery looks a little bit more towards like the right side of this image. And here we have the Cecilia Jimenez attempt to restore Ecce Homo, a fresco made by Garcia Martinez in 1900, just by using a little bit of house cleaning product on top of it because it was dusty. And somehow we lost a beautiful piece of art, but we also got the ability to, or this image conveys me a lot the idea of how different is the quality of a visual percept on the left side, and an imagery, a mental image that is kind of just part of what the visual perception image is giving me. So if I think about my subjective experience of mental imagery, I know that the first thing that I have to do is I have to go somewhere, which is most likely my long-term memory, and try to generate an image from long-term memory. And I kind of feel that this mental imagery creates, it's sort of a gradient. If I tell you, think about an apple, you think about the apple, but then I think about an apple, but then I also come up with some sort of background, right? It's never an apple in the void. It's an apple and something. So the subject of my mental image comes first, and then it's back. Of course, my mental image, or in my case, and I think this is mostly the case for a lot of people, my mental image is never as good as if I were in front of a visual percept. So the first thing I need to generate the mental image. But then, if you think about it, and this is where my two pathways of mental imagery and attention kind of converged, you need a mechanism that allows you to maintain that image alive, and that allows you to explore. Is she looking at me or not? Is her hair curled or straight? So I need something that kind of keeps it on for as long as I need in order for me to explore that mental image to perform, I don't know, a mental rotation, for example. Can I park my car in there? Does it fit? Is it too small? So spatially rotate my car without moving it to see if it fits or not. Oh, it's too small. Okay, now I'll try with another parking spot. The third thing that I'm asking you, they have to do in mental imagery tasks, at least, or in the example we did today, is decision making. So is she me or not, or curl or straight? But this third part, in my opinion, doesn't feel to be mental imagery specific. Most likely the circuitry we're using for decision making is the same circuitry we're using for decision making in front of a perceptual image, very likely. So where is this project coming from? Well, the current model of mental imagery, the one that is in your textbook of cognitive neuroscience as well as mine, is mostly based on early visual imagery evidence of visual imagery from most likely the group of Koslin, both fMRI, PET, and TMS studies showing that mental imagery somehow relies significantly on the activation of the primary visual cortex. So we're talking about V1 and V2. It's funny because in reality, this model that started, as you can see, in the early 2000s, 1990s, early 2000s, kind of lived a long life up until today, in which this model that requires the activation of early visual areas keeps being refined, but with this component of early visual areas activation being very strong still in the model. So if you look on the left side, we have this diagram in which somehow the number one from Joel Pearson's work, who is also doing amazing work on mental imagery. So we have number one, which is this big blob on the DLPFC or prefrontal cortex. Then we have number two, which is this circle that goes into the lateral middle temporal gyrus. Then we have two arrows going to three, one pointing at the superior parietal lobe and one going back to the early visual areas, V1, V2, maybe V3. So this is what people think right now about what is a mental imagery. And on the right side, instead, we have kind of a, let's say, a new way or a model that tries to identify as or portray mental imagery as kind of a reversed process from perception, meaning this is called a reversed hierarchy model with mental imagery starting from I want to come up with something, so a top-down signal from the parietal, from the frontal lobe saying, hey, now I want to think about Mona Lisa because this dude is asking me to do this exercise. So a top-down level of control, going back to the perceptual level, pulling some information. While the, and then, so going back to the perceptual level down to V1. While perception would be the reversed process, so a reversed hierarchy, as I said before, starting from your eye, going back to your optic nerve, optic tract, V1, V2, V3, V4, ventral stream, and then eventually coming up to the parietal and frontal lobe. So this is the current model of mental imagery. This is recent stuff on Nature Review Neuroscience. This is what a lot of people has been thinking about. However, there is a long-standing issue with the current model of mental imagery. And I say long-standing because, and Paolo is here in the room, so he knows much better than I do. And you all studying consciousness in patients with vegetative state and so on, really appreciated the relevance of brain lesions and the causal information that they can provide when we study, some cognitive functions. Well, it's now 27 years that we know that patients with no V1, with complete bilateral resection of the visual cortex, of the occipital lobe, do have perfect mental imagery. So how can we reconcile this stuff? So how can this leading model be still out there if causally we know that if you don't have V1, V2, you don't perceive stuff, but you can still imagine it. This is what leads somehow into this project, and also into another project that I'm working on, which is a new non-human mental imagery, and this is being helped by Laura Tremblay, who she's reviewing the literature on non-human mental imagery and showing how, again, in the past now 40 years, we've been recording in animals, of course, with certain degree of variation because mental imagery in animals is very difficult to study, but we have been recording on temporal lobe area. And there's no evidence that early visual cortices bilateral are involved in mental imagery. So this would be another, big pointer at, do you need the early visual areas to imagine something? And I'm going to stop here 1 second to sip some water and see if you have any question. And otherwise I can go on. All right. So this idea that Paolo and I had about a new model of mental imagery has so much converging evidence in the literature that we keep reviewing articles and writing about it, and we find more and more and more evidence, from Mark Desposito's work on 1997 to plenty of stuff. And one of them is just last year, this group from Finland, Toru Dottir and colleagues, they just showed that there's an architect famous architect who around age of 50 had a lesion and lost the ability to imagine. So a person that was perfectly functioning up until his 50. Can you still hear me? I see some, yeah, okay. So somebody that was perfectly fine and able to imagine stuff suddenly lost the ability to imagine. And here I'm gonna cut it short, just I don't wanna dig too much in this result. But what it seems like that differentiate this aphantastic architect from other non-aphantastic architect with brain lesion was this kind of cluster on the left medial and inferior temporal lobe, this area on the left side with this red blob. That's where the lesion, this architect had a lesion that other non-aphantastic architects had. So this led somehow to an article that we just published, which is titled very strongly, I would say, but it was time to kind of try to put to open this debate once again. That is titled Visual Mental Imagery Engages the Left Fusiform Gyrus, but not the early visual cortex. And it's a meta-analysis of image evidence, and it's a paper that looks like this. So I'm sure that you will rather refrain from reading it carefully because it's one of those huge meta-analyses with a lot of tables, okay? But I'll give you just a hint of what we found, what we did. First of all, we went on Neurosynth, Google Scholar, and all these other meta-analytic databases and looked for any article that was that had the keyword imagery, mental imagery, visual imagery, and so on. And it was about fMRI, of course. So we found about 100 articles. We had to skim down a lot because of, maybe single case studies or PET studies or including clinical subgroups, doing MVPA or connectivity analysis only, and so on. So we ended up with one big contrast, which is what I'm going to discuss the results in a few minutes, which is only 27 studies discussing imagery over control. And if you kind of go one by one meticulously and pull the coordinates that come up from these 27 articles, you will be getting about 376 different coordinates. It looks like this. So this is the raw way of looking at mental imagery, visual mental imagery, contrast with baseline or control conditions overlaid on surface. What are the results of the study? Well, first of all, is that we find what we call the fusiform imagery node, a small node, but big enough to show up in our meta-analysis, located in the inferior temporal lobe, not very medial, but still in the inferior temporal lobe, that was activated in mental imagery. But somehow we did some control analysis, also motor mental imagery, and we saw the same thing. So a fusiform imagery node. Very interesting, this fusiform imagery node seemed to fall where in a specific area that Lawrence and et al. In 2017, if you look at the bottom left corner of this slide, it looks to be like at the boundary between FG2 and FG3 area. Sorry, FG2 and FG4 area. Somehow, in this study, they did a cytoarchitectural investigation of how many regions we can have in the fusiform gyrus. So the other thing that was interesting was that although we didn't find complete overlap with the lesion that the architect showed, somehow you can see that we were really meddling, that our fusiform imagery node was really close to where this famous architect kind of had a lesion on. So this is the first thing we found, a fusiform imagery node. But the second thing was substantially no evidence of early visual cortex activation. I don't see anything up here. And that was my face, of course. Like, again, we were not surprised. We were just very happy. We were not surprised. But thanks to the work of Zhanghao Liu and people that are much better than I am at Bayesian analysis, we actually did a spatial Bayesian latent factor regression model on the same coordinate of the meta-analysis that showed the fusiform imagery node to see if we can actually claim the absence of activation, right? Because our claim was not, there's no activation, but we have to prove it, we have to test it. And right now we live in a Bayesian world, so we can do that. So we actually were able to identify that this doesn't seem to be any activation in the coordinates that we found. The method is from Montagna and Torwiger article. We can dig into that later on if you want a little bit more. What are these colors representing? Areas that are colored are giving you a Bayesian factor value below threshold of 0.33, meaning we can absolutely, we had evidence to reject the presence of activation in that area. While the white shows numbers that are below 3, or actually I think that all around the visual cortex we had about between 0.33 and 0.7, 0.8. So overall, really evidence against the presence of visual cortex activation in mental imagery. So 1, there is a node in the visual system, but not in the early visual cortex that is activated in mental imagery. 2, it doesn't look like we need the early visual cortex activation. And that was me when we saw these results. But then suddenly I was meeting an old friend, and the old friend was, well, bilateral frontal eye fields, bilateral parietal lobe activation, anterior insular cortex, anterior cingulate cortex. And I was like, but these are my buddies. This is my people. These are the frontoparietal and cingulopercular network that I've been reading about for 10 years or more. I don't want to say the years, but this is what Corbetta showed, right? These bilateral networks of frontoparietal regions activated in attentional orienting. This is what Dosenbach in 2007 has shown as the cingulopercular network, anterior cingulate cortex, anterior insular cortex. This is what we found in attentional network studies in neuroimage, and recently in what we call the cognitive control network. So I was there looking at this stuff and thinking, okay, I think I have to ask myself more questions. So I'm also going to give you a few seconds to ask questions if you have any. And I'm going to sip some water. All right, okay. So banging against the wall of attention, I was actually working on another project about attention as well, which I'm going to talk about in the next 20 minutes or less somehow. So the other project I was working on is, does attention increases conscious visual perception? Because we have 3 different theories kind of fighting against each other, that have been fighting against each other in the past years. Beautifully reviewed by Catherine Talon-Baudry in 2012 in her Frontiers in Psychology articles. 2 of them keep being alive. The second one, the reverse dependence hypothesis, is kind of getting less attention now. But somehow on the top left, we see the gateway hypothesis, somehow stating that attention precedes consciousness and that decision-making follows consciousness, meaning attention is a prerequisite of consciousness. You need attention to be conscious of something. But at the bottom panel, we have the cumulative influence hypothesis, which is what Talon-Baudry actually favors, stating that attention and consciousness are 2 different functions, 2 different neural systems, 2 different mechanisms, and that both of them influence decision-making, with consciousness having a stronger, you see the thicker arrow, to a stronger connection to the decision-making compared to attention. But what is attention? Just a brief definition. I like Posner's tripartite model of attention that separates this system into 3 components, what we call alerting, the ability to sustain instead of readiness over time, orienting the ability to select one feature of our visual world, in the case of visual orienting, to select to improve the processing of stimuli that happen in that field, in that specific part of the visual field, and that can be separated into exogenous when it's the stimulus that bottom-up activates my orienting function, versus endogenous when it's you top-down deciding that you're going to pay attention to this screen that you have in front of you right now and nothing else. So two different systems. An executive control function, which is a system for inhibiting distracting information and selecting the correct answer when you are in front of a conflicting situation. So in this other article we are working on, we identified somehow distinct contributions on visual conscious processing for these two systems that we just saw over here. Let me go back 1 second. We're looking about orienting of attention and how exogenous and endogenous cues affect visual conscious processing. So this study is an MEG study that has a pretty simple procedure. It's a Posner-like task in which you have a first fixation, then you have a cue, which is just a very tiny dot on the top right corner of the bottom right box. So look at the right corner, right side of the cue slide. You will see a little dot on the top right corner of the box. And after a fixation, you have a Gabor patch, a target that is a stimulus that we can manipulate the contrast, so we can somehow identify which threshold, at which threshold you subjectively see it and not see it. And after a fixation, we ask you to either tell us whether you discriminated correctly the orientation of the Gabor patch, tilted to the left or to the right, just to make sure that you actually saw it. And a subjective or detection task, we ask you to tell us whether the Gabor patch was presented on the left side, on the right side, or it was absent. This is a very, let's say, very fine-grained, granular explanation of the task. What we need to know for the sake of this presentation is that we somehow were manipulating these two systems, the exogenous and endogenous orienting systems. The exogenous cues, the exogenous system is manipulated by cues that don't give you an indication of where the target will be presented, meaning that somehow you have a cue, this little dot appearing either on the right or on the left box, signaling where the target could be presented, but they are not informative. So they are non-predictive, right? Meaning that 50% of the trial, the cue indicates correctly where the target will be presented, 50% it doesn't. On the other side, we have predictive cue task, in which this cue is kind of informative of where the target could be presented. It's usually 67% predictive, meaning it gives you a good idea that if you follow it, most likely it's going to give you an advantage because your attention will be already oriented to the place where the target will be presented. So we have 18 participants doing the non-predictive cue task in MAG and other 14 participants doing the predictive cue task in MAG. So what did we find very briefly? We can dig into these results a lot if you want later on. What did we find in the non-predictive cue task? Well, that if you look at the bottom part of the figure, you have a timeline 0. I drew this as a clock where the cue is presented, and you see what happens as the brain activity kind of goes by. We don't see much going on in the brain if we compare seen trials versus unseen trials for non-predictive cue. Up until the presentation of the target, about 100 milliseconds after the presentation of the target, so we're about at 400 milliseconds after the cue, in which we see somehow this early right occipital and then frontal activation that then kind of lights up everything in the brain up until 800 milliseconds. So nothing from 0 to 400, then about 100 milliseconds after the target, we see the brain responding for seen versus unseen targets. So if we kind of blow up this kind of 400 millisecond thing, we can see that this activation seems to be mostly right lateralized and seems to start from the bottom, cluster 1, from the bottom of this occipital area. Then it kind of calls all this parietal region at 444 millisecond frontoparietal kind of activation, a forward sweep that then goes back into a backward sweep, calling again visual parietal and occipital areas at 468 milliseconds, and then lighting up what Stan Dehan will be calling the global workspace network and so on. Another blow up of this spatiotemporal dynamic of activity from the occipital lobe to the frontal frontal lobe in the right hemisphere, and then going back at 468. So how about the predictive cue? The situation was completely different in the predictive cue, and actually we found an interaction between conscious reporting a target, so seen versus unseen, with valid and invalid trials. In this case, we're looking at the difference between valid and invalid trials in the seen condition. So what happens in this case is that besides all these words that I just said, which are very detailed, which are a lot of detail, what we see is that somehow in the endogenous condition, when we are looking at predictive cues, we see an activation, a brain activation that precedes significantly what we saw in the exogenous condition. So here we see something going on very early, like starting 100 milliseconds after the cue, and then this bilateral network that is already is already on before the presentation of the target, before 300 milliseconds. So here I'm displaying on the left side this exogenous orienting cue, showing a right lateralized and very late activation of frontoparietal network. While on the right side, we have the endogenous orienting network, much earlier activation of a network that looks like it's bilaterally activated. And again, frontoparietal. But I've seen this before. And this is what I showed you before about from Corbetta's work, right? So somehow this seems to be relating to the right lateralized activation for stimulus-driven control, the network in yellow on Corbetta's figure that is frontoparietal and only right lateralized for exogenous orienting, stimulus-driven control. And a bilateral network in purple on Corbetta's figure that is again frontoparietal, but then instead is more for predictive cues or endogenous orienting, meaning I want to follow this lecture, this talk. I want to follow this cue because it's going to orient my attention later on. A little water, and is there any question about this? We're almost finishing. All right. So I'm going to ask you now to do this exercise with me and just to try to piece it together, what I just showed you, and do it together. So this was me 6 months ago. Sorry, I heard somebody aging. Is there any question? I don't want to go on or forward. Is there something unclear?
No, it seems there aren't any questions.
All right, fantastic. All right, but we will have time in a few seconds really to talk about this more. So again, let's piece it together. So this was me really looking at the top, a mental imagery network with this fusiform imagery node, but also a lot of frontoparietal stuff. And then looking at the exogenous and the endogenous network and staring again up and then right and then left. And thinking, but so what can be the relationship between, what is this frontoparietal network activated in mental imagery doing? Because I have it here. And this was me all of a sudden when Paolo Bartolomeo, here present as always, said, well, you cannot be surprised by mental images. And that's where I thought, okay, so if you cannot be surprised by mental images, meaning there's no stimulus driven in healthy controls, we can be discussing about post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety disorder, but in normal condition, you don't have Mona Lisa coming up at you suddenly, but mental imagery is something that you call voluntarily, that you activate. Well, then maybe what we're seeing here in this other study is that to activate a mental image, you need a place that relays the interfaces with long-term memory and a network of brain regions that kind of helps you sustain this image over time. And then, of course, I went back and everything seemed clear. And I went back to the literature, and a lot of people are talking about this. It's just always too much on the background. The mental image requires the generation from long-term memory. And there it is, our fusiform imagery node, the fin in red. And this could be the interface with hippocampal, parahippocampal information in the middle temporal lobe, as well as anterior temporal lobe activation for high-level kind of description of the image and so on. But this could be our cluster in this new model for the part that is related to what is the information you're trying to come up with. But also we said that we needed a mechanism for the maintenance of these mental images, for the activation, for the generation and maintenance of these mental images. And of course, it was very likely from the beginning that this mechanism was going to be a frontoparietal cingulo-opercular mechanism for attention, working memory, stuff that helps you sustain that information over time. So we are now trying to, we have started proposing this new model, and we have to work on it. This is really a diagram of what we have come up with. But it's very likely, it's first of all, more refined than what we have in the textbook, because it has three very special places in the temporal lobe where we think that the interplay is happening to talk with the memory stuff. But also we have no visual activation because it's not needed. And we have a very clear idea of what these frontoparietal networks are doing. And with this, I'm going to open up with discussion. And I want to really thank a lot all the people that are working with me on this work, or maybe I'm working with them on this work in the past years. And we'll conclude with one thing that I know a lot of people like to have. These slides will be absolutely available to all of you. And if you haven't done enough, if you we're not quick enough to write which references I was discussing about, this is my favorite slides usually, because I like to have all my references cited in the presentation at the end. So feel free to ask for this presentation. I'm happy to share it. And this is all the stuff that I've been talking about in the past few minutes. All right, thank you so much. I hope you liked it.